Okay, so as promised, here is the combined week 7 and week 8 discussion of imperialism and colonization. And I know in many respects these questions look like flip sides of the same thing, but I think it's important to understand the difference between imperialism and colonization. Imperialism is what the mother country is doing and how it's benefiting from control of these colonies. It is effectively the mandate sent from the mother country to its various colonies to control them, to limit their activities, to establish their control. Colonization is what's happening on the ground, and often it's what's happening to the people who were there before the people from the mother country came. So it's a lot more about how these indigenous people are having to give in, and the power dynamics and the changes in culture, the changes in living conditions that happen on the ground. All right, so it's important to understand that these two things are twined together, but they are different. Okay, so the two sets of questions, and again, I know these look very similar. The two sets of questions are compare and contrast Imperialism 1.0 with Imperialism 2.0. What are the similarities and differences in their motivations, and the types of colonization practiced and their motivations? In the way the colonized peoples were treated, how are the ways that colonized peoples responded in 2.0 that were different from 1.0? How are they still affected by imperialism 2.0? Or how are the ways the colonized people respond to 2.0 different from 1.0? How are we still affected by imperialism 2.0 today? How do the isms that come with industrialization intersect with this new imperialism and colonialism, and why? All right. Now, again, that's under imperialism 1.0, but it talks a lot about colonization, which is why you need to be sure you understand the differences. The second question, the empires of 1900 are very different from the empires of 1500. The highest standard of living in the world of 1500 was the Middle East and Asia, yet by 1900 it's now Western Europe. Why? Trace the developments of this shift from 15 to 1900. How and why did the societies in the Middle East and Asia lose the high standard of living that they had? How do their empires change and why? What problems do they face as the Western empires come to compete with them? How do they change the nature of colonization of Western European empires today, and why? Okay, well, not today, but and why. So again, they seem similar, and certainly with the second set, it's stuff that we've been talking about, but now it's putting it front and center. Why did the West win? That's really kind of inherent in this. So the required sources were whatever your textbook chapters were. And interestingly, no Harari in either of these weeks. You did have the Davies and Imahar interview on Fresh Air, The History of American Imperialism from Bloody Conquest to Bird Poop, which you could have either listened to or you could have read. I personally, of course, prefer reading, but inversely, it's entirely up to you. There was a little play button there on that thing. Also, though, there was a Frankopan chapter, chapter 18, and as I've noted, many of you have made comments about how, well, okay, that's not really, where we are with this, because chapter 18 takes place after World War I, or at least the discussion he's at. Yes, it does. And no, it doesn't. Because a lot of what he's talking about in there is the situation with why and how imperialism is changing, especially after World War I. I mean, leading up to World War I, most of the players already understood it, but World War I was a break point in the understanding of technology, and the new technology now was completely driven by oil. And so he's talking a lot about how the European powers and the United States adapt their behavior and their manners of getting into control of places so that they can do it more expediently and to get what they really want, which is oil. And he talks a lot about how some things work and some things don't. The 10-minute history piece that followed the Ottoman Empire and the birth of the Balkans, this directly leads to World War I. It's a very good discussion of, again, how an Eastern Empire collapses, what goes wrong with it. And then Modern Life, the Vlogbrothers, is particularly important for the quote that I put at the end, because he does a good job talking about the massive changes that have happened with the Second Industrial Revolution and how it's changed Europe, but also how it hasn't. So I want to bring those into context as we go through. So why 2.0? Okay, so the simple short answer about imperialism 1.0 was that it is, as we've discussed, very much driven by trade and about the need for this rising group of merchants in Europe to get into the very lucrative trading societies in Asia and South Asia and India, and about exploiting the cash crop situation in the Western Hemisphere. So it's literally driven by wanting to make more profit. 2.0 is also driven by wanting to make more profit, but now we have the Industrial Revolution at play, which means that it doesn't take as many people as it takes people to buy things. So we get a kind of shift in the way the market is working. One of the interesting side effects of the Industrial Revolution is that it actually is going to kind of lead to this desire to do away with slavery, which is part of why that becomes a thing during the revolutions, particularly the Atlantic revolutions, is that many of them are driven by this idea of doing away with slavery. But part of that is because they don't need that anymore. The Industrial Revolution, particularly in Western Europe and eventually in the United States, is driven by using poor people. But that's also part of the trade out. We might get rid of slavery, but now we have poverty, and that poverty can be grand and extensive. The Industrial Revolution starts in England, but spreads very quickly to other places, particularly the United States. In fact, there are many historians who argue that one of the causes of the American Revolution was Britain's mercantilist laws, particularly the Wool Act, that precluded or prevented the colonists from being able to establish industry because the British didn't want to have to compete with that. They wanted all industrial goods to come from Britain and to have to be bought by the colonists, not to be produced by them. And this is something that's also going to drive parts of 2.0 in other areas. The big driving thing, of course, and as I tried to make clear in the discussion about the revolutions, mercantilism gives way completely to capitalism, and capitalism becomes the defining point of empires, literally, in the sense that they now figure out other ways to do this. All right, so the difference between imperialism and colonialism, I kind of did this when we started this. Western colonialism, a political economic phenomena whereby various European nations explored, conquered, settled, and exploited large areas of the world. And this is literally on the ground. Imperialism is state policy practice or advocacy of extending power and dominion, especially by direct territorial acquisition or by gaining political and economic control of other areas, which is a lot of what we see happen in Asia, because it involves the use of power, whether military or economic or some subtler form. Imperialism has often been considered morally reprehensible, and the term is frequently employed in international propaganda to denounce and discredit an opponent's foreign policy. Or, as I like to put here more succinctly, imperialism is what the new rulers are imposing, while colonialism, is what is happening to the people they are imposing those new rules upon. Imperialism is the policy and power of the winners, while colonization is the consequence for the losers. And that's very much the distinct difference between the two. Okay, so colonization becomes different as well. When we were looking at imperialism and colonization 1.0, a big part of it was driven by controlling land, but also having workers to use that land. So in 1.0, the Western Europeans come to the Western Hemisphere, and they basically subjugate and force the native peoples to do the work, and then when the native peoples begin to die out, they force the Africans to come over and do it. They also even begin to bring over some of their own people in the form of indentured servitude. 2.0, however, is driven by the idea of making the people of an area do the work, but making them do it through their own control. So it's driven, as I say here, from a transition from mercantilism to capitalism, and through the Second Industrial Revolution, which expands the need for raw resources, but also for new markets. And what we don't get here is that in the Industrial Revolution, as I said, leading up to like the revolution of the British colonies against Britain, one of their problems was that they weren't allowed to practice capitalism. They weren't allowed to develop their own industrialization. In 2.0, the empires are being built specifically on the idea that they're not going to allow their other colonies like China, the Middle East, India, any of these areas industrialize. And in fact, one of the key goals is to prevent that. Because what they want is to force these people to produce the raw resource they need, which is why we see an expansion suddenly in the need for cotton, in the need for many of the things that become central to textiles, because they want these peoples to produce those things, send those goods off to the mother country or wherever the closest industrial facility is, and then sell them back. So basically, they take the part, interestingly, that the British colonists in the Western Hemisphere rejected and instill it everywhere else. Settler colonialism continues, but with settler colonialism, it's only going to be in specific areas, and it's in areas that they feel the land can still be used to produce cash crops. So while after 1776, the British aren't perpetrating settler colonialism on the Western Hemisphere because they don't control the Western Hemisphere anymore. They are perpetrating it on Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, all the areas in the South Pacific that they take for control. Inversely, the United States picks up the idea of settler colonialism from the British and uses it as a mechanism to extend their territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and then from there to embrace 2.0. Now, to be fair, the United States doesn't actually go into the Philippines, Guam, or any of those areas with the expectation of removing the natives. They pretty much adopt what I refer to later as administrative control when they get to those places, because their idea is to control them, but to make the people do the work. All right. So here we are, settler colonialism versus administrative colonialism. This has a lot to do with who you've got to do labor and whether the value of the area that you're taking is actually in the production of something or whether it's in the market of something. So historically, administrative colonialism has been what peoples have done. It's definitely what the Spanish and the Portuguese do. It's effectively what the British will do everywhere except in the South Pacific and in the Western Hemisphere. It's that idea again that you want to maximize the land by producing stuff on it, converting that stuff to finished goods, and then selling it back to that market, but you need that market in place to do it. There was a point here that I just had that I want to see. In India, China, Southeast Asia, and part of the Middle East, Europeans continued the practice of administrative colonialism by controlling local rulers and coercing them into making their people do what Europeans wanted. And this is a big part of what Frankopan consistently talks about. When he talks about how the British in Chapter 18 were trying to install their own sympathetic members of that society into place, he's doing that to say basically these are guys that the British could manipulate because these guys were already trying to adopt Western culture's ideas, mindsets, capitalism. They're trying to make money. So having them in place means that they are better able to tell their people what to do. This allowed those peoples to retain their culture, religious practices, language, and other cultural characteristics, though they were still forced to do the bidding of the Europeans. And they're still going to be forced indirectly into submission because the British later, towards the end of the 1800s, are going to go in here and they're going to start talking about how their society is so much better. And it's because of their culture and that these other places need to adopt their culture, their religions, their morals, their views on things. So we begin to get the eradication of culture as a byproduct of administrative colonialism. This is the civilizing mission. In 1.0, Europeans were struggling with their own religious conflicts and wars. This was whole, religious Reformation, the counter-Reformation of the Catholics, the wars between Catholic nations and Protestant nations, etc. With 2.0, the Europeans have arrived at the idea that they have a moral imperative to civilize these other peoples of the world. They're demonstrating the power and superiority of their own culture. In this end, they attempt to convert peoples to Christianity, particularly Protestant forms. And this is interesting because in 1.0, what we really saw were Catholic forms out there trying to gain new constituent members. In 2.0, we see the Protestants out there not so much worried about the numbers of people, but worried about this idea of culture and saving these peoples. This is part of where we get Pratt's idea of kill the Indian, save the man. He doesn't mean actually physically kill the Indian. He means kill the culture of the native in the person and force them to conform to European ideals, thus saving them. Or in this case, since Pratt was in the United States, U.S. ideals. They attempt to force peoples to adapt Western dress, manners, and culture, and they attempt to eradicate cultural elements from these people that they find offensive or immoral. Brutality still exists, though, is demonstrated horrifically in the scramble for Africa and the treatment of Africans. Among the worst examples, which Harari's already told you about, King Leopold of Belgium, the Boer Wars of the British, the genocide of the Herero and the Nama peoples by the Germans. So yeah, it is horrific. Many of the things that happened to Native Americans, and were still happening to Native Americans, we could talk about the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, are also happening in Africa as well. So what did happen to the great empires of the 1500s? And again, this goes straight to Frankopan. It goes straight to Harari. It goes straight to this idea of Imperialism 2.0. The wealth gained by the West, as Frankopan would tell you, turns into technology and particularly into military weapons. The wealth that the Europeans are extracting through either administrative colonialism or settler colonialism or extractive colonialism are all functions of taking the wealth from the people producing them and using that wealth for the benefit of the mother country, and then turning around and keeping these people so impoverished that they can't resist. The Europeans, in turn, use this with the rise of capitalism, which, again, as Frankopan talks about, or Harari talks about, they encouraged experimentation, scientific development, scientific revolution, and then the Enlightenment, and from that, this continued technological growth, like Industrialization 2.0. In 1500, the Chinese, Indians, peoples of the Islamic empires had that knowledge, but they never build on it. And as Harari would tell you, they never developed the capitalistic desire to build on it. Thus, they're not ready to deal with the new power and technology that Europeans have. And with Imperialism 2.0, the Europeans prevent them from being able to by refusing to allow them to industrialize unless it benefits the European nation, which is part of why when the Ottoman Empire gets limited railroads, it's because it's going to help the guys who need to move oil and other things out of the Ottoman Empire. And those guys are going to be Europeans. I would point out here, this is a big part of what Frankopan discusses throughout his book, but The Road to Compromise gives a number of examples of the attitude of Europeans in this period, particularly towards the decadence they perceived in Middle Eastern culture. In reality, European technology, particularly the creations of weapons, was a major reason why these older empires could not defend themselves against Western empires. Harari and Frankopan both talk about Frederick the Great of Prussia, who in the 1700s invested heavily in the science of ballistics. This drove European powers to develop similar tactic approaches, first against each other, but then later against these other peoples that they wanted to control. In the wake of the Opium Wars, during the self-strengthening movement, which some of you talked about, thank you, specifically in the essay on, or the discussion on revolutions, they did not turn toward Western weapons and training. and were inconsistent in their approach to how to do it, and that's part of the problem. In the same way that during the U.S. Civil War, one of the reasons the South lost was because it did not have uniform railroads, and they didn't connect to each other because great plantation owners didn't want railroads running through their land. So a lot of times the military took much longer to move from place to place because they had to stop and march 10 miles to hit the next train, and because they couldn't join trains because the widths and the gauges of the rails were inconsistent or different sizes. Europeans, or not Europeans, the Chinese had the same problem. During the self-strengthening movement, they bought guns from different manufacturers that used different bullets and used different technologies. So they couldn't trade them back and forth among all of their troops. Some groups would have one gun, some another, and that made it very difficult when they were actually trying to fight. This made Europeans able to consistently defeat them and to demand larger and larger trade concessions, because that was the thing. Europeans didn't want, like the Opium Wars, the British didn't want physical control of China. They wanted the Chinese to do what they wanted the Chinese to do. They wanted them to produce silk. They wanted them to trade in silver. They wanted them to do all these things that the Chinese didn't want to do. So beating them, instead of basically saying, we're going to go in and take over this land, they basically said, no, we're going to get larger trade concessions from you. Standard of living, as most of the empires were being colonized by the Europeans, the standard of living for these people declined, of course. And we see examples of that throughout your textbook, Harari, Frankopan, the Ottoman Empire video, all of these. That Imawar piece talking about guano, I mean, good Lord, it was horrific to produce. Instead, it would ultimately lead, with this decline in living, to many peoples in these colonized areas, like India and like China, attempting to revolt, but they were revolting against their own administrations because their own administrations were adhering to what the Western Europeans wanted. Addiction to opium, supplied by the British to try to limit the amount of actual silver they had to pay to the Chinese, led to a marked decline in the standard of living for many Chinese people, one of the first basic structures of addiction. Inversely, the standard of living for Europeans rose as they benefited economically from the labor of the colonized peoples, the control of the market for goods they produced, and the benefit of controlling industry to convert those raw resources into finished products to force those people to buy. The consumer economy at play. So, instead of settler colonialism, the imperializing nations wanted to control the people of the colony to get them to produce what they wanted and to create markets. They also wanted access to the land itself, particularly water and ports, because by this point in time, when we get to the late 1800s, you are looking at steam-driven boats and oil-driven boats as being the nature of the transport of goods. So a lot of what European and the United States cultures wanted, governments wanted, was control of ports of resource, or literally ports, where they could pull their boats in, their armies in, and their navies in, and they could get raw resource to supply their military weapons and their trade weapons. We see this particularly in the early 1900s. Theodore Roosevelt created what was called the Great White Fleet, which was a complete overhaul of the U.S. Navy. Its very first stop is Japan. And the reason for that is because that, unlike every other power in Asia, when the Japanese were forced to open up for trade with the Western world via Commodore Perry, instead of fighting it, they optimize their society to adapt Western technology. They start sending their best and brightest students off to schools in the United States and into Britain. They study industry, they study technology, they study trains. They bring all that knowledge back and they develop the same technological base and the same ability to invest in a modified capitalism into Japan, and then begin to build their own empire. And I point this out to you for two reasons. One is because if you're watching this, this is one of the questions on the final. So hopefully you're watching this and you're like, oh my gosh, here's a question for the final. The other reason is because it leads them ultimately to compete with the Western powers on on a level playing ground. Uh, Japan, had they had more people, could have won World War II. So bear that in mind. They embrace Western technology, the Second Industrial Revolution, and even to a limited degree, capitalism. And they bring these ideas into their own society where they keep their own cultural definitions. That's what's actually really fascinating about the Japanese is they keep their own cultural definitions, but make these elements work within it, which is why they manage literally in like less than 40 years to become economically and industrially competitive with the Western powers. It's why they beat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War ending in 1905. It's why when they start expanding into the South Pacific, the United States and the Western powers can't really do much about it. All right, so this whole idea then of trade ports becomes very important. Military ships needed ports, military power shifted to the oceans because it was protecting trade. And thus, in order to be able to go around the world, you had to have colonies everywhere in the world. And of course, the British are going to be supreme with this. The U.S. enters the game of imperialism itself by taking Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, and American Samoa. And this is this is because of the idea that they need these ports. And there's still that weird juxtaposition, which MOR talks about, where many Americans think they're doing the right thing for these people and are kind of astounded by the fact that the people resent what they're doing. The Filipinos, particularly, had asked the Americans to join in order to get the Spanish out because they wanted their independence, but then the U.S. comes in and basically takes over. All right, so the high points of the Davies and Imahar article: guano needed as fertilizer, drove the conquest. Or the need for conquest by the U.S., mainly because of the Midwest. They needed guano to grow things. The mining was horrific, as they talk about. Interestingly, because of that, though, we get the creation of the U.S. empire starting legally with the Supreme Court and William Henry Harrison, because the Constitution effectively did not allow the U.S. to become an empire, as I mentioned earlier. But the Supreme Court says, well, okay, if we're going to have control of these, we've got to treat them as our territories. And then Harrison basically sends, because of this guano situation and that revolt, sends some of his own people out to research it and figure out what's going on, mitigates the death penalty for the revolutionaries, but then turns around and puts them in, irony of ironies, hard labor for the rest of their lives. We get the Filipino War and its casualties, 250,000, if not more. The U.S. begins an interesting process of supposedly helping the Filipinos by centering them in concentration camps. And these will be concentration camps that are the model for what Hitler will do in World War II. And then we get Rhodes, the virologist who goes off to the Philippines to study disease and ends up being, well, again, setting a precedent for the guys who worked for the Nazis. Frankopan talks about the British and French mandates in the Middle East after World War I, particularly because of their realization of the desire for oil. At the same time, the new Soviet Union attempts to persuade the Middle Eastern nations to join them, which in many respects is beneficial. Ultimately, many of them will, and that's going to lay the platform for the Cold War, which we're going to be getting into after World War II. The British attempt to install governments in Persia and Syria, and this is them setting up the puppet governments, like I said. The U.S. itself attempts via Standard Oil to gain influence in Persia as well, and in fact, ultimately, in the game of influence, the U.S. wins. All oil companies do their best to thwart the concessions or the royalties they are supposed to have promised to have paid to these Middle Eastern empires. That in turn is going to lead to a lot of the problems that the Persians and others have with the West, not only then, but even into today. And in fact, Frankopan has this wonderful quote on page 343, 344. The Persians and others who were watching saw a different moral in the story. The lesson was that, for all the bluster, the Welt's bargaining position was a weak one. Those with resources could ultimately Form the hand of those who held the concessions, fold the hand of those who held the concessions, and make them come to the table. And that's what happens then. Unfortunately, it is not what's going to happen in the long run. And that's a lot of it because of they got the deals, but then also didn't get the money for them. All right. So from the videos, the one that I think is most significant is this particular quote from John Green. When I ask you what does it mean to be modern, most of you attempted some really good answers, but here's the real one. As Green says, I revealed my own bias in this episode by talking about the modern practice of public funding for education. And I'd like to point out he's owning his bias. This is, again, a central part of what you're looking for when you analyze primary and secondary sources. Still others note that the idea of modern has been used for many centuries. The Roman historian Tacitus, for example, both in the 1st century BCE, born in the 1st century BCE, was happy to have lived in modern times. And so maybe modern is just a term to positively compare one's own times to other places and periods in history. And in that sense, to call one society modern is mostly just propaganda. It's just basically to say that your society is better. It kind of harkens back to that idea of bringing civilization to other peoples. To pick back up with Green, all of this leaves me wondering what makes our contemporary world feel modern, and to what extent modernity is a judgment on ourselves and others. And I say that, I bring this to your attention, and I think it's very informative, because this really is a big part of why I hate words like modern and progress and those words that really don't mean anything, but certainly have a big tinge of condemnation in them or a big tinge of criticism in them. So when you use words like that, be sure you define what you mean. All right, so that gets us through 7 and 8, discussion 7 and 8. This is my works cited. There you go. We're going to be starting week 9 pretty soon. Well, tomorrow. I'm going to get a CT out as soon as I can. This, though, think about these ideas, think about these issues. And again, if you were paying attention, think about one of those questions on the final. I will see you soon.